Treating the root cause of your histamine intolerance is the only way to completely heal. How do we actually find what's driving that excessive histamine or inability to break it down in the body? So we've covered histamine intolerant subjects before. There's a great little video on some herbs that I'll commonly use for histamine intolerant patients. But today I really wanted to cover some of the root cause drivers of histamine intolerance. And there's two things that I think when a patient presents to me in the clinic with what I suspect is histamine intolerance, whether we know it's histamine intolerance, they've reduced histamines, they've done some of these kind of histamine modulating protocols and therapies and improved, or whether I strongly suspect that histamine's playing a role in their symptom picture, I'm thinking two things. Number one, how do we stabilize the patient? How do we build up that histamine blockade so that they can feel better, right? Symptom improvement, so important. Sometimes you need to do that to get to the next leg of the treatment, which I want to talk about today, which are the common root cause drivers of histamine intolerance. I can't tell you how many patients that I've met, that I've worked with, that are just living on over-the-counter antihistamines. Maybe they're on mast cell stabilizing drugs, ketotifen, cromolyn sodium, there's a few other ones, H1 blockers, H2 blockers, whatever it is, and they feel better, great, but it's not resolving their symptoms. They're kind of hooked on these drugs and therapies, whether they're natural, whether they're pharmaceutical, it's just a Band-Aid. Band-Aids are great, we use Band-Aids all the time, but again, we want to be dealing with the root cause drivers. So just a little disclaimer, dysfunctional immune system can get very complex. There are a lot of moving pieces to the immune system, particularly when inflammation is ramped up and running rampant. So let's not get lost in the weeds. Let's keep it basic enough so that it's understandable and actionable. This is something that you can take to your practitioner if you're working with one, or if you're looking to work with one, you can kind of vet them by discussing some of these possible root causes that might strike a chord with you when we go through them. So the big question I have for you, think about it, what connects infections in the body, inflammation, environmental toxins, and exposure to things like pollens and dust mites and the like? The answer there is antigens. And that's the big piece that we're going to be covering a lot on when we talk about mast cells. There are sentinel white blood cells. They are looking for problems. The rest of the population, they don't see something like a pollen or a dust particle as a problem. And for some reason, your mast cells in your immune system is starting to recognize these things that are coming into your body or already in there. If we're talking about infections or imbalances in the gut, inflammation run rampant, they're looking at them as problems, and they're mounting an immune response to deal with those problems. This is all great, fantastic, an immune function that's working properly until it goes on and on and on and isn't resolved. So this can get quite deep. Immunology can get very complicated. Let's keep it simple. Mast cells, they're little white blood cells, and they live on the lining to organs that open to the exterior. So things like your sinus tract, your gut lining, your urinary tract. They're found in the mucosal layer, the epithelium, and even in the connective tissue underneath those layers as well. And they're really the first alarm bell. They're almost like the canary in the coal mine. When they see a problem, they get activated, and then they liberate and release, sometimes degranulating, sometimes just liberating a few certain molecules to actually go and trigger another response from the immune system. So today we're talking about histamine intolerance, but just remember that mast cells aren't just liberating histamines, they're liberating things like leukotrienes, they're liberating certain cytokines, kind of inflammation modulating messengers for the rest of the immune system. They're calling in other parts of the immune system to resolve what they perceive as a problem. In my clinical practice, the most common things that I see as drivers of a little bit of like a twitchy mast cell, a little bit of an unstable mast cell, if you can pardon the simplification there, would be bacterial dysbiosis in the gut. That's a really prime driver of mast cell degranulation and histamine liberation. Certain gram-negative bacteria in particular, that lipopolysaccharide, the endotoxin on the cell wall, can go ahead and trigger those mast cells. They're very potently immunogenic. They can trigger an immune system reaction. And so when we're looking at symptoms, there would be all the typical symptoms. Maybe they're classic symptoms of SIBO, maybe they're classic symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, maybe someone has loose watery bowel movements, they're bloated, they can't tolerate foods, maybe they have symptoms of leaky gut. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get to the enzymes that are responsible for breaking down histamine shortly. The other really big one that I commonly see that I suspect could be a driver and I would be looking for to test for it would be fungal overgrowth and also mold growing in the digestive tract and mold exposure in the environment. Things like mycotoxins can trigger mast cells. And the end kind of pathological state of these activated mast cells would be a mast cell activation syndrome. Remember syndrome, it's a bit of a kind of spectrum. It's hard to diagnose, but these mast cells have become primed and are ready to degranulate and liberate all these inflammation mediators like histamine at the drop of a hat. Mold exposure can be huge here, so do not miss that. If there's any suspicion of mold exposure, you had a leak in the bathroom that wasn't resolved, you pulled up some floorboards and they're all moldy, you had a leak in the house and it's growing mushrooms, it's not something to ignore or to think lightly of. Other really big ones that I see, they'd be subacute viral infections, the chronic viral infections that haven't been resolved. I would be questioning why the immune system isn't robust enough to resolve that, why there's this simmering infection kind of on the back burner. And the other really big one, I don't see it commonly, but you know, it's common enough here in Australia, definitely more common in different parts of the world, particularly in the United States and in Canada, would be Lyme disease and Lyme-like disease. A lot of those systemic infections can definitely trigger mast cells and histamine intolerance. A few other big ones that we haven't talked about related to mast cells and mast cell degranulation and an excessive amount of histamine coming in, filling up that bucket, causing those symptoms. And remember, you can check out some really common symptoms in this video here would be heavy metals. There's two big ones. There's mercury and aluminium. Those have been well studied around mast cells and histamine liberation from mast cells. And a couple other big ones would be herbicides, particularly glyphosate, inflammation, and if I could put this in capitals, stress. Stress can be a potent trigger of mast cell degranulation and histamine intolerance. So that would be one constellation of root causes for histamine intolerance, mediated around antigens, you know, things in the environment, things in the body, imbalances, exposure, heavy metals, mold, something that's actually triggering that immune system, inflammation, damage to tissue in the body is going to trigger this inflammatory cascade, and mast cells can get involved and get recruited to liberate all these messengers to then go on and recruit more immune system players to resolve that inflammation. The second big player in histamine intolerance that could be driving some of your histamine intolerance symptoms would be nutrient deficiencies. And this is huge. I can't tell you how frequently we find something like mold exposure, fungal overgrowth in the body, bacterial dysbiosis. They're dealing with histamine intolerant symptoms, and they're using up all of their resources much faster to actually break down these histamines in the body through different enzymes. And there's a great little concept here from Elizma Lambert, just a beautiful way to think about it. She's just a master at thinking about this. Check her out. She talks about these drains. And if one of your enzymes and the nutrients, you know, the vitamins and the minerals and the coenzymes that power these enzymes, if it doesn't have enough of these resources to power the enzyme, it's not going to work. And then you're going to get a buildup of that metabolite and you're going to deal with symptoms. And with histamine, it really depends on what enzyme isn't working well. She calls this the drain, and the drain can be blocked, and you want to be unblocking this drain. And I can tell you, again, from clinical practice, that unblocking an enzyme and supporting these enzymes with targeted nutrition, targeted supplementation, can go a long way just to make someone feel better while we're dealing with the root cause. Again, the root cause could just be nutrient deficiencies, or these root causes could be stacking on top of each other. You got food poisoning, that developed into SIBO, and then the SIBO is generating all this inflammation and all this lipopolysaccharide endotoxin that's triggering mast cells, that's generating more histamine. You've damaged some of these enzymes that are in the small bowel, diamine oxidase, DAO. It's a big one we're going to be talking about today. And then the histamine isn't getting broken down as it should. The enzymes are blocked, the pathways are blocked, and it's like 1 + 1 = 10 on the symptom side of things. So if we're thinking about histamine breakdown, you know, histidine through to histamine, and then it can go two different ways. It can go through the gut, breakdown in the gut, and that through DAO, and then down into aldehyde dehydrogenase. These are enzymes. And it can go through intracellular histamine breakdown, which would be through a methylation enzyme, histamine N-methyl transferase. It's going to get complicated. We're going to keep it simple. From there, it goes to MAO. This is through the methylation side of things. And the last little step, again, is aldehyde dehydrogenase again. So there are shared enzymes in both pathways that can be compromised. And if you have any issues with aldehyde dehydrogenase, you are going to have real issues. These are the patients that have problems, just do not tolerate alcohol. And that's because aldehyde dehydrogenase breaks down aldehydes, and aldehydes are part of the alcohol metabolism pathway as well. And aldehydes are potently neurotoxic. They are things that the body just does not like, does not function well, depletes things like thiamine, B1, and then you wind up depleting resources, thiamine, which is so important for so many different functions in the body. And the enzyme's not working, you're causing this neurotoxic picture. Headaches, migraines are really big here, and that histamine pathway is backing up into symptoms. So we're going to save the complexity of the enzymes for a different video. I want to probably spend a video on each of the enzymes. DAO is a really, really big piece right here. You can actually supplement with the DAO enzyme. And if you find, wow, just with that enzyme on board, I feel so much better, I'm going to be starting to think, why don't you have enough of this DAO running? Is it an infection in the small bowel? Is it something like SIBO? Is it something like leaky gut? Or do you have some nutrients that aren't enough to kind of fuel this enzyme and power it? The other really big one there would be part of the methylation end product, a deficiency in SAMe, S-adenosyl methionine, and that is the cofactor for histamine N-methyl transferase, HNMT, that enzyme, right? So if you don't have enough of these nutrients, they're going to be building up, they're going to be causing symptoms. It could be a secondary issue. It could be the original root cause. Maybe you're nutrient depleted. Maybe you haven't been eating a real nutrient dense diet. Maybe there's some absorption issues. Maybe you have low stomach acid. Maybe you have exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. Maybe you have leaky gut. And again, you're just not absorbing these nutrients that you need to run your body. The third huge root cause for histamine intolerance that I see C. Don't forget, you can have more than one of these. I've got many patients that are mold affected. They have heavy metal overload. Maybe they have SIBO as well. And my job is to find that thread to pull. So we're not treating 10 different things at once, to bring everything into balance and to get some momentum on the case. Maybe it's just improving your bowel movements. That's huge. But the third big piece here would be the genetic influence on your ability to break down histamines. We just talked a little bit about nutrients, and I like to think about nutrients again as cofactors for enzymes, right? They're almost like fuel for enzymes to make them work. Without these nutrients, the enzymes aren't going to work as well. So that nutrient side of things, that's important. On the genetic side, we're still talking about enzymes because genes code for enzymes. But the big thing here is with mutations or alterations in the genes, particularly SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, they can impact your ability to govern an enzyme. And the most popular one, it gets a lot of press. Originally, I didn't think it was so important. And now I'm seeing a bunch of patients with methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase issues, SNPs, MTHFR. And the big one there is depending on the heterozygous or homozygous mutations or alterations, it's going to be impacting your ability to get this enzyme working, to spin off and to spin B9, to methylate B9 into the methylation cycle, right? And the end of the methylation cycle, everything's in circles, so there's no end. But to keep it simple, the end of the cycle is to produce SAMe, the universal methyl donor. Just methylates everything, right? And it runs all these enzymes, histamine N-methyltransferase, catecholomethyltransferase, all the methyltransferase enzymes run on SAMe. That's the cofactor. And so when you think about genetics, maybe you've done a 23andMe, maybe you've tested your genes, you might feel very kind of restricted and hampered by your genes. I would encourage you to think more about things like lifestyle, mental health, gratitude, nutrition, exercise, living cleanly so that you can actually kind of clean these dirty genes. That's a bit from Ben Lynch. I really like that thinking. And really support these genetics and support these enzymes that they're coding for so that you're not totally on the back foot. Really big one there would be things like living a low toxin life. So I can think of one patient that fits all three of those root causes. She came to me with her methylation status already in hand. She was heterozygous for the MTHFR gene, meaning that that enzyme was running a bit slower. Her ability to methylate was a bit compromised. Not a deal killer. Again, presenting with extreme histamine intolerance symptoms, like definitely in that top 10% of severity. We ran an organic acids test, which is a baseline recommendation for any chronic or complex conditions. Any questions, running an organic acids test, particularly from Great Plains Labs, can really help most people. You can check out more of that right here. And we found that she had a pretty severe B2 deficiency. Now, why is that relevant? If we're talking about that second root cause, nutrient deficiencies for histamine intolerance, B2 is a cofactor for a bunch of different enzymes that are relevant here, but most notably, it is the cofactor for MTHFR, the enzyme. It was already running slower because of genes. If she has a significant B2 deficiency, it's going to run a lot slower, and her ability to methylate B9, shunt it into the methylation cycle, and produce SAMe, the universal methyl donor, would be compromised. I would assume if we tested, she would have an insufficient amount of SAMe being produced in her body. So those are two of the root causes. I said she had three. Also on her organic acids test, she had a significant overgrowth of green mold and candida in her digestive tract. I also suspect that she had SIBO. We didn't test her. And I suspect that she had leaky gut as well, so gut damage, inflammation. Maybe that's leading to those food intolerance symptoms. Maybe that's degrading some of that DAO. We're going to get into that in a future video. But the big piece here, the 10,000-foot view, is those infections and overgrowths would be triggering those mast cells to degranulate, add to that histamine bucket. The nutrient deficiencies in the genetics would be slowing the enzyme's ability to break them down, and she wound up with pretty significant histamine intolerance symptoms. The last little piece here, and this might be a little bit too much, I gotta pace myself, is that fungal overgrowths are pretty potent producers of acetaldehyde, and again, that's a neurotoxic product. Aldehyde dehydrogenase, that enzyme can degrade that and get that out of the body, but that's all shared with the histamine pathways as well. So we're overworking this enzyme, we're burning through all the resources at a faster clip than we would if we didn't have that fungal overgrowth on board. So I hope that helped. Those are the 3 common root causes that I see for histamine intolerance. I know they're a bit of a constellation of symptoms, but that's how I kind of think about it, and that's how I kind of divide my attention. We're going to be evaluating and asking questions and figuring out, doing some testing, seeing what's going on in the body and why someone is dealing with really significant histamine intolerant symptoms. In future videos, we're just going to geek out on those different enzymes. There's a lot of value there in supporting enzymes. Genetics, I don't really go into genetics too much. You can do a lot with diet and lifestyle to help support those genes and get those nutrients in. I see more value with that approach. And the infections and the overgrowth and the toxins, the mold exposure, that's really where I see the biggest bang for your buck in terms of focus and testing and treatment. If you like the video, like it, subscribe, leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you in the next video.